Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to our Xfinity Pro Track Guide. This week for Xfinity, we are at Auto Club Speedway. So, just kind of dive straight into this. We're going to have some pretty cool temperatures this week. Means a lot of grip, means a lot of entry speed, means a lot of on throttle time. On the initial onset, we get to throttle. So, give you guys some notes already, some quick notes. I will be on the tighter version as my notes declared and what I ran my 20 lap run here with. So just kind of tackle this before I go into this chase view and in-car perspective. Again, pretty cool track. We're at 76 degrees right here. Your wind is definitely going to play a big factor at what end of the track you're the loosest avenue, the tightest avenue, maybe on entry, center, exit. So pretty inducive to what wind direction is and speed. And most likely you're going to have a lot of wind speed here at Auto Club Speedway. It's kind of always been that way. So to kind of dive into this, I want to preface how we need to attack our entries. And it's a long sweep and entry, I would say, at both corners, but it's a sharp sweeping entry, if that can be thought of here, and I'll describe it here. So, as far as sharp turning away from the wall, you might be turning away from the wall for a little bit of a longer distance than you would think at a track like this because you really flow up towards the wall, kind of how we are here at this perspective. We're going to start tracking up to where we get to this little weight logo that you see all the way here that I'm circling. And that's the reference point to get closer to the wall, right? So we have all the ability to shape our entry how we want. And again, I'll get a cockpit view and I'll keep it in this chase view for this first lap here. 20 laps I done, and briefly just talking about it, a lot of fall off even with these cool track temps, and a lot of very varying lanes that we can have. So let's kind of get right into this. I'll speed it up here. And we can look how we're starting to track out for this actual weight logo that I mentioned. Not saying we got to get right to it, but I'm strictly looking at that for reference points. That hey, that's a general area I know I'm going to be getting the closest to the wall. Slowing this down here, and you can tell I get to the 3 marker on the fence. So I do the first lap a wider arc into turn 1, and the next lap that will cover on our lap 2, I do a more sharp and shallow entry compared to running through these bumps. So let's dissect our turn 1 entry because it's very important at a track like this to not overshoot it. These seams and this track itself is quite bumpy once you transition all the way from your turn-in approach off the wall and then get into this white line. So, but factor that in. You cross these seams, you can upset the car balance if you're not decelerating smoothly, or if you decelerate too much with too much wheel angle, you could be sitting on the splitter too much. And for our set on tighter, there's no question we're going to be hitting the splitter a little bit at various points on entry, and that's just to keep downforcing the car into the center and getting off the corner. So let's slow this down a little bit again, turning away from the wall at this light, you know, but I'm already loading the front at this point. I'll give you guys a cockpit view. I'm already loading this front end up to the left, almost going into this 3 marker, right? So factor that in. I'm loading the car. I'm making sure when I start decelerating, I'm actually loading the front with not too much wheel angle to just have a snap into the car and point me too aggressively into turn 1. So pretty flowing corner entry on this first lap, and again I changed it to second lap. This 2 marker is a good indicator to start fully lifting at the rate you feel like you need to. And older tires you may drive in a little bit further because of the less entry speed you would have. And again, let's factor this in. You can tell how much we're really having to dissect and be precise in loading our front end and rear connected together through these bumps. I know it's hard to see, but you can see how much movement the car is having right here. That's some splitter contact. That's also just going over the bumps. And I'm still part throttle first lap. So you have a lot of grip and potential to get into the entry. So to talk about this at center portion of one, if you're completely in this lane and you can't even get to this bottom, it's similar to how we went over the notes and video in old Atlanta. If you're having that trouble at that bump at Atlanta, think of it at this track. If you're having that same trouble here, you want to make sure you're getting your trajectory down to this white line on newer tires. And if you're having that struggle point, it's because you're carrying too much speed, not not slowing it down enough to let the front be positive and help you pivot, and your radius into the corner, while also you could have too much throttle again through this whole exact phase. You can see how much part throttle I get to help the front get connected, and I'm having to play with that throttle a little bit. It's not just a fixed rate of, throttle. Now, I'm I would say if you're running this bottom, the most important aspect to get to this white line is how you're crossing this seam. And I'll give you a cockpit view here, obviously, and I'll give you a chase perspective. So how your left front crosses, majority of the times on newer tires isn't the issue. It's how you get the right front to connect and pass through the seam. But you still have to factor in that left front crossing it, because as soon as the left front crosses it, you can have a little bit more of a pivot to where it helps you turn, or again, if you're carrying too much speed, you could just be pushing the tighten into this car, and you have to get a little bit less throttle, which is just it is a common area of this track. So if you guys can work on your entry and not carrying too much speed, we'll have a lot better week in just managing our center speed because we're not overshooting our center. This track is notorious for people overshooting entry, and that costing you a lot of center to exit momentum. And center and exit momentum here is all your lap time. So factor that in again. And crossing the seam, how you plug this left rear is really important too. You can see I have a pretty decent balance, and now I'm crossing right front and right rear over the seam. Now that is pretty much the focal point of how close I want to get to this bottom. And again, you can see how bumpy it is through this section. See how much movement this car has dynamically. And it's just going through those bumps. That's how aggressive this car is and how aggressive this track is. You have to attack it here. So you can see on part throttle, pretty simple. You have an abundant amount of grip center to mid exit ultimately that we can deal with. Car is going to be naturally more free trying to get off the corner because of how light it is. Now, turn 3. I would recommend how you can attack this entry is using this safer barrier. And let's get a cockpit view here. This safer barrier, how it extends inward to obviously the white line and everything like that. That should be a reference point to load the front end before if your objective is to get to this bottom lane. Okay? And even ultimately if you're running the middle. You'll have a fixed rate of how much you want to turn the radius of your wheel, your steering angle, and how much you're going to get off the throttle. Now, I think turn 3 is I would definitely say probably the least looked at corner as far as how people need to attack it. If you have a lot of potential driving into the corner, that is great. But again, much like 1 or 2, how you get into your entry is going to dictate your center to exit momentum. If you're ever shooting it and you're fighting the car, a lot of times it's just better just to be consistent over these bumps, because I actually think 3 and 4 as a driver is the most difficult section of the track. And it's really just navigating the bumps once you get to this white line. So turn in, I'm not using so much angle, right? I'm not using so much angle to turn into the corner, just trying to balance this car out, to get to the front end so I'm not causing such a tight feeling once I get off the throttle a little bit and start decelerating it even more. And again, I'm trying to just make sure I'm not cutting this entry as well. So a little lift, going through these seams, quite bumpy already now. Going through these seams again, part throttle. Now, once again, turn 3 is probably going to be more frequently the loose condition in our weather that we tested, and what we'll test in our Sunday test session. And if we're just swatting flies on entry, we'll back that down by just smooth wheel transitions to the left, smooth part throttle technique, and just making sure we can get to our line to be consistent. Definitely the most bumpy section. You can tell I'm having to kind of correct as soon as I get to the center over a bump, but car is pretty much naturally able to sustain that grip. So let's look at this again. You can see how bumpy it is in the chase perspective. Really bumpy, part throttle, not using too much wheel angle when I'm actually doing too much shifts in my throttle percentages, because again, it's bumpy, it's going to throw you around. You're trying to be as active as you can in connecting that front and rear together to help you as a driver also get off the corner as straight as possible without any wheel slip in the rear, but also not pushing the front tires off. So a little bit free here, but we're in the throttle pretty aggressive here. So we got a lot of room to track out on this cool track temp. As you can see here, 76, this wind, pretty aggressive. Now we talked about turn 1 last time on our lap 1 and how I had a little bit of a wider arc. I went through the bumps a little bit more, and now I'm going to have a little bit more of a shallow entry. And once again, we're using this royal purple weight logo on the wall as a reference point. That's the general area we need to get closest to the wall and set our front end up to turn into the turn 1. You can tell similar attributes, similar technique. Wheel to the left just to load the front a little bit. I'm going to start turning away more fully at the light, and I'm going to have a shallower entry, and I'm lifting at that 2 sign again. That's just to help load the car, keep it consistent front to rear. Throttle percentage will matter, once again, how you're attacking this entry and keeping the car stabilized. Now, if you're running like 50% throttle all the way to this point and dumping the throttle at the Auto Club 1 sign, you're going to cause a really profound tightness to this car because you're carrying too much speed over these bumps. And remember that, because we just talked about how your entry will dictate your center and exit at this track. That is a quality that we cannot afford to overshoot into this Auto Club 1 of using too much throttle. So, shallower entry I had this time. Made sure I got my grip to the front and rear connected crossing these seams. I got to the bottom earlier here, and how I can tell you how I got to the bottom earlier is you're going to see a big bump that I just crossed right here. How I had a later turn in to the center. Now I'm actually crossing it sooner. And now, right here, is exactly that bump. That is a good reference. I know it's hard to see and remember, but it's before this Auto Club Speedway. And just to kind of briefly talk about that again, the closer you get to this weight line, the more grip you'll have. But if you shortcut it too shallow, once again, you're going to cost yourself a little bit of entry momentum that hurts your center momentum because you're actually having to regain all that throttle point and be more aggressive to gain that speed back. So it is very important not to shortcut your entry, have it too shallow of an entry in turn 1 or turn 3. It is one of the hardest tracks, I think, to actually run the bottom here and make momentum because a lot of people will shallow that entry too far. So pretty easy, aggressive on throttle. We got the grip. Very important to remember how we need to cross these seams. It's pretty bumpy everywhere, but crossing these seams are really important not to. If we're free at this point and you're crossing the seam, you're going to have to start unwinding the wheel just before, right on top of that seam to help counterbalance the car and really get the car to connect, so you don't have to get out of the throttle. So crossing that seam on the bottom, you're going to get pinched off a lot on exit if people are on the top and someone's on your outside. So remember that quality is not going to be a good trait, right? It's one of the difficult things in cool track temps, and at this track specifically, you have a lot of lanes that you can run, but you're on the bottom. A lot of times your exit gets pinched off because of that. So same qualities here. Turning before the safer barrier goes inward, part throttle, and just stabilizing the car. You can hear how much I can just drive into this entry, but it's not going to give me anything because I know I need to start creating momentum at a certain point for my lap time. So instead of just driving in to 100% throttle at this point and then dumping the throttle and having to just be erratic with steering wheel, it's better to be proactive and keeping the car stable through these bumps and knowing when to get to full throttle on new tires and old tires. So these are just first couple laps here. I'm going to go to our lap 15. You can see how much fall off we had at 15. 1 and 3/10 basically, 1 second and 3/10. And gonna tackle this once again. Same approach. Now you can see I'm not turning away aggressively as I was the first time at the 3 sign, but now I'm going to start lifting earlier at this light. This is 15 into the run. This is just a balance entry. You can tell I'm still using part throttle. This is just a balance entry, get the front connected so I can get to this bottom at the rate and angle that I want. You can see I use a little bit of brake here. This is important. You're going to be using this in traffic most likely. You don't want to use too much, obviously, when you're trying to cross these seams. It's very important to start getting off these brakes at the seam when you're crossing it and focus again on your center to exit momentum. A little bit more of a free condition exit because the rear tires are getting a little greasy. You still have a lot of grip to be 100% throttle, but remember that it's pretty difficult to just sustain that slide on exit. I would not recommend just sustaining a slide. All right, again, turn in 3 was pretty much the same. Earlier lift point, fully off the gas now, and stabilizing the car on entry, keeping part throttle just to keep the balance together in turn 3. And this is pretty much on max limit of potential on the car right here. Now you get more throttle, you can see how much steering angle I have. It's actually countering a little bit back to the right, just a hair. And that's just to cross that seam, crossing the seam again. That's just some qualities this car is going to have in this track. So something to factor in there is pretty important to recognize. Now go to our lap 20 here. This should be our last lap we'll look at. And we should be running the top side here. Now, on Tata version, the closer you get to the wall at this light to the 2 sign and the 2 sign into turn 1 running the top, it's quite bumpy. So if you can actually straighten this entry up a little bit to get the left front driving on top of the seam, or the inside of your left front tire, not the outside, the inside of your left front tire, just below the seam, you'll have a lot better avenues to kind of work yourself up to this wall. You can tell how much I'm driving right on top of it. Left front's just barely crossing it in general, and I'm back to the throttle. So you have a lot more capability in creating momentum up top here and getting to the full throttle point earlier. And if you ever shoot this whole section and just cause it to go through these bumps, you can see how much part throttle I had initially. That's just to help set the car. You can see I got a fixed rate set in the car, set in the front end, and then now I'm getting off of it because I'm going through these bumps. And I'm trying to make sure I'm not carrying too much entry. So I'm in a rolling phase right now. And again, I'm trying to attack this seam as well as I can up top on 20 lap old tires. Now I'm finding the point where I got the front gripping. I can feel the front gripping. And I'm not just instantly going 100% throttle, right? So to recognize that, why I'm not doing it is because I don't want to just shear rear tire life off of it, but also I don't want the right rear to be too dominant at this early portion of the corner. I want to work some momentum back into the car and keep some stability in the car at the same point, and that's how you do it. And the closer you get to this wall, the tighter you're going to actually get, and it'll hurt, because you're actually trying to stabilize the car. Tighter will obviously straight stabilize the car. But you can tell a lot of confidence and ability to wrap the top here. Now, to dissect this even more, there's going to be some wheel corrections that you see here that are pretty important to recognize. You turn away from the wall. You have some capability of just wrapping the seam. Pretty bumpy track still, but this exit will narrow obviously through these signs on the wall and narrow to the exit of turn 2 right when they end. So it's not a hard corner to finish if you just don't push up too early and run into, running the wall here. The higher you are on entry, more tight you're going to be, and if you're already front limited at this point compared to the rear, you're just going to cause a push even worse the higher you are on exit here. So you can see how much room I'm giving up here. I'm trying to keep this left front actually on the seam. And again, it narrows. You can tell how much room I had up here. And you can see how much it's going to narrow on exit. That's why you don't want to be up right at in this general area. You don't want to be right up on the wall because you're in the full throttle commitment. You're trying to keep some stability in it, and you're trying to turn and keep some front positivity grip wise. So remember that. Something we'll look into. I'm going to go back a little bit again through 1 and 2. Now, another lane that is pretty dominant at certain points is running how you have the car on top of this seam. You're going to be utilizing this seam as a reference as well. So you're going to be basically a lane down using that seam in the same exact way that you would the top. But you're just not going to be able to get to the throttle as early on full commitment because you're actually having to stabilize the car with a little bit more wheel angle to the left and wrapping the exit, a little bit tighter. So keep that in mind. Something to definitely tackle, and definitely going to be proactive when racing others. But once again, going up top, just shearing some tire life off of it. Not the best avenue early on into a run, and something we'll tackle on our Sunday session. So don't be afraid to just experiment, see what you can do pace-wise. Our benchmark, our looser variants probably have a little bit tendency to build looser and also not hit the splitter as much. So that's something, just run through each setup that you can and see what you can get out of it. So off throttle completely here again, a little bit free, trying to keep some neutral balance in the car, but more towards the free side here. You can see part throttle. And then at a certain point, I just know I need to get to 100% throttle because this exit is very important just to create some momentum. And I know I didn't run the top side in 3 and 4. I don't think in these cool conditions it's the best route on just solo runs. But to factor that in, instead of turning down here, you can run the wall, no question. You can run the wall that you want in 3 and 4, but you lose so much time because of how much grip will stay on this bottom lane. And even if the bottom lane's not there, you can run this middle lane, a lane above, the second lane above, and the third lane above. And that gives you a lot better confidence in stabilizing the car on throttle and not being so free. So something just to factor in again. It is very dependent on wind direction and how you can kind of navigate some of these corners and the speed of it, but knowing how our time will start and time of day that we're racing in, and especially the date that you see here, it's going to be cool track temps, pretty high winds, and something just to remember on. So when racing others, simple again, we race the car and we race the track. That's one thing you have to do and remember is racing the track and the car and not overdoing everything else, right? So I look forward to seeing you guys in our Sunday practice sessions if you can make it. This should be a fun week, a challenging week, just because how we got to attack our entry and really not overshoot it to make sure we're keeping our high speed momentum loss at the rate exact area so we can actually start focusing on creating momentum again. So, but appreciate you guys tuning in. Should be a good week. And if you guys check in and you guys don't hear from me through the holidays, wish you guys a happy Thanksgiving. Um, should be a fun week. Have a good holiday week. And thank you for tuning in.